Okay, so in the last video we saw where we can get to grips, at least initially anyway, with running Docker locally. So creating our application image from a base image, and then essentially creating a container, a runnable container from the application image that we created. And that was running locally, which was all great. No problems there. Now, one thing I did do is give a little bit of incorrect information there, because when we did the Docker build to essentially take our Docker file, which says there's the base image, here's my application essentially, and go and sort of go and run it. First of all, I did have the port mapping that I didn't include, but also when we did the build, I gave it the name of awesome app, but I forgot to actually put :v1, which is the tag. I think I referred to it as this was the tag, but in essence that's the name of the image, but there's the tag there, which is obviously after the colon. Okay, so if I do that again, so we've got the same command, I just missed the :v1, but if I try that, that'll just build, again it's building from our base image, merging it with our application and creating another image. Okay, so if I just if I can spell, there we go, if I do Docker images this time, you can see there now we've got awesome app, but it has now got the proper tag. Okay, so that was the last bit that from the last video that was missing. So that's just to give you a bit of a heads up so that you're not making the same mistake as I did. But what I'm going to do is just remove that image, and I can do that with, there's various ways to do this, but I'm just using the image ID, which I'll put in there, get rid of that. There we go. Images referenced in multiple, because I'm using it across, so I'm just going to do /F to force that. That's okay, I didn't want to keep it anyway. And what I'm also going to do in a second, if I just clear this screen, you can see I've got, there we go, I've deleted the local image. You know, in the last video we had a local image and we created the container from it. What I've also got is a way now to actually build and push the image to the Azure container registry. So at the moment, whenever I create an image by doing a Docker build, in its sort of primary state, if you like, it's basically building that the repository is local, so it's building locally. Okay, and you can see that that's why these are all like images on the local, all these. Okay, things like that. But obviously, where you can see things like this, this is obviously building on a repository, a Docker. So a repository basically is where you store your images. So I've got an Azure container registry. That's the service that it's called, and I've called it Linux containers. And you can see I've got there we are. There's the actual repository for the application that I'm dealing with, Node.js Web API. So what we'll do, I'll just flick into the Azure portal at the moment. So I've logged in. I've already got a container registry, but the way I created that is simply go to create a resource. You can go through, obviously either look down in your recent list, or in this case container registry, it should show up. There we go. Okay, and you can go through the create process. Now, you know, you might want to check the price and details. It's pretty good for, like, if you dev testing, it's not going to cost too much. You know, but have a look, obviously. But if you go through this process, again, I'm not going to go into details of the Azure side of things. I can do that as a separate video, but it's fairly straightforward what you have to go through. You basically set up names and things like that, what you want to call the repository and whatnot. So I will just jump into the container registry that got created. So you'll end up with something like this. So if I just collapse that down a bit, oops, it's not going to let me. There we go. So you can see there's my, these are a few things that we need, things like login server, things like that. Now, what you'll find is this is just the, as I say, I selected the basic registry. I didn't need anything fancy. It's just for dev testing anyway. You can see I think I've got 10 gig available. I'm hardly using anything for my, I mean, it's what, 80, 100 meg maybe, or something like that. But basically, once you've created your container registry here, the important bits, there's lots of stuff that you're going to be able to explore, I'm sure. But one of the main things rather is repositories. Okay, so I created a repository called Node.js Web API. So when you look at my my sort of, I've got an image here that I've been using. You can see there that line, Linux containers.azure cr.io corresponds to, if I go back to the overview, there. Okay, so that's the login server. That's where it lives, basically. But the actual repository itself is called Node.js Web API. So again, back in there, that's why we've got the Node.js Web API. Okay, so you can obviously create, you know, as many repositories as you like, really, but I've just got the one at the moment. So from the last video, we have obviously an application living at this level, and we've got the Docker file that we've managed to create an image locally and run the container locally. But what we're now going to do is build and push that image up to Azure, so it's not, you know, not going to be on our local machine anymore. It's going to be put that repository, put that image in the repository on Azure. Okay, so the way you do that is there's a couple of commands that you need to run first. So if I go back to overview, what you'll need is this login server here. Okay, and what you will do is do a command called docker login. Okay, give it that server there. Okay, yeah. It will then basically, if I've come back to there, if I press enter, it'll ask you for a username and a password, which I'm not going to do because I'm already logged in. But where you get the username and password from is under access keys. I'm not going to show it because it's got my username and password. I could have changed it, but ultimately there's nothing magical in there. If you click on that access keys, you will see there'll be a username, and it might be Linux container or Linux containers, and there will be sort of like a password. I think there's two. There's a primary and a secondary password. I use the primary one. So, but ultimately, once you do the Docker again, Docker login, that URL, which is just hiding there, this one, yeah, and like I say, once you press enter, it'll ask you for those, the username and password. That's all you need to do from that perspective. So that means that you will have your container registry set up. Okay, we've actually got a repository, as I say, Node.js Web API, and what we're going to do now is build our image to go into that repository. And the way you do that, if I go to there, is that command. It's not much different to what we've used before, in fact, because we did the Docker build in the last video, and we gave it a name with a tag, and I just corrected that at the start of this video. So we had a name like awesome app and then :v1 as an image. The difference here is that there's the actual where the registry is, there's my repository, and there's the version that I'm going to be pushing. And again, we've got the space dot, meaning the context is this application that's in this directory. So the Docker file is Exactly that. It's the same thing, but basically it's just building up onto the container registry repository. So if we have a look in this repository, so again, when you're at the overview page in Azure, you just see, obviously you've got the main server address there for the registry itself, but the repositories live under here. Okay. And there we go, I've got the repository there. Obviously over here I could technically delete the repository. There's things called webhooks so you can detect when changes are made, and there's all sorts of automation things you can do, which we're definitely going to do in a different video. But if I click into this repository, you can see at the moment I've got tags which are akin to versions. That's the way I look at it anyway. So I've got a latest tag here, and we are going to be able to create an instance or run a web app from that. So essentially this is an image and it's being tagged as latest. Okay, I could have lots of tags in here, lots of versions of that application. In fact, I'm actually going to push build and push one called V1. Okay, or maybe actually I'll call it, let's just jump back there, I'll call it demo V1 just to be a little bit clearer. So that doesn't exist yet. As you can see, latest exists, but I'm going to push a new version, a new tagged version. Okay, but the way that I do that is, like I say, I do a build first. So if I press enter there, and it's sending the build context. So what it's doing, instead of it building locally, it's actually building up using the context of the Azure Container Registry. But I've built it, but if I have a look at the images now, you should see I've now got demo v1 there. Look, that wasn't there before. Okay, but at the moment, even though I've built it, if I do refresh there, it's still not here yet in the repository, because I need to do one other command, which is to push that newly built image from my machine upwards. And the reason I gave it that, it's the context. It's saying, well, this is the repository basically where this image is going to live. That's why when I did the build command, I gave it this so that it knows not to build locally, but to build for the Azure Container Registry. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is push, basically. So that's a command that we haven't used, because normally when we built the image before, we then did a Docker run to run that image in a container, essentially. But in this case, we're actually going to push it. So let's have a look here. And there we go. It's pretty much similar to the build, but we've got a push. We don't have to specify -t or anything. We literally just give it the there's the repository, the server and the repository, and then you've got the tag that you want to push. Now I called it v1, but of course it's now called demo v1. Okay, so it basically means I want to push that image up to that container registry. Okay, so if I click OK, you can see it's doing a few bits and pieces. And I explain about what happens with the layer already existing, because it's clever enough to know that you've got a version up there and it just pushes the differences, as far as I'm aware anyway. We'll go into that a little bit more, but ultimately it's pushed that up to Azure. So if I now have a look here and refresh this, you should see we've now got, yeah, there we are, demo v1. That's what we've just pushed. So that's now an image. It's living in the Azure Container Registry that I created, called Linux containers. Okay, so ultimately I've got the option now. I can delete, I can untag, I can create a webhook. Again, when a version gets updated, I can create a webhook, do some things, you know, automated builds, automated deployments, whatever it might be. But ultimately what I'm going to do is run an instance. Now there is something on Azure, I don't know how recent it's been, and I've used it, but there is something called Web Applications for Containers. That's, to be honest, I don't know the specific differences. I believe that actually is under the web application. So under the app services, you can create essentially a it'll have a full URL and act like a web application basically. So that's fine. But an instance will run in a Docker container on Azure in this case. And at the moment, I'm not sure. There might be some changes that I've missed or whatever, but when we create an instance, in other words a container instance, it gives us an IP address, but because it's on Linux at the moment, it hasn't got a fully qualified name, a DNS name basically. Again, I'm not 100% sure if you can attach that, but this is the one I'm going to use just at the moment. There isn't a lot of difference in just the high level anyway between these two, but I'm going to run an instance, and that's exactly what I'll do. So this is going to take this image and create us a runnable container in Azure. So it's totally in the cloud now. It's nothing to do with our local machine. So if I click run an instance there, I'll give it a container name. Well, let me call it DS. Let's hold up. Awesome app. Doesn't matter. Excuse me. There's the container image which it's got there. It's Linux OS, but you can see if I had an image that was Windows, I could deploy that as well. I have a resource group which is just a container to keep all services together. I'm using US East. And I can then specify the number of cores. Obviously, be careful with this because obviously, whilst the container is running, you're going to get charged for it. Now, this is one of the small, obviously, one core processor, 1.5 gig of RAM. It's not going to cost a lot, but it is going to cost some money. So just be aware of this, and obviously do a little bit of research to find out the pricing for the Azure container instances, as well as the container repositories as well. Just, you know, it's worth having a look at that yourself. The other thing is public IP. You could have a private IP, well, or no IP at all, so it's just an internal thing, but we want to be able to access this. So a little bit like where we did the expose to run the Docker container locally at port 80, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, now there's no security on this at the moment, but I'm going to throw it away quickly anyway afterwards, or even add some security. But this is going to give us an IP address that we can connect to. Okay, so if I click OK, this is now going to go away and fairly quickly, I might add, create a container. So this is the equivalent, if I just do that, this is the equivalent of us doing a Docker run to create the container locally. Okay, so but obviously in this case it's creating a container instance within Azure that we can actually connect to. Okay, so I'll just close down a couple of these applications while that's waiting. And what we're going to do, we're still going to use Postman, but as you will see, we'll be able to use a public IP address. So the application will be running from the Azure container, obviously not locally. So that'll give us a test. And because we're using, again, MongoDB Atlas, which is a cloud-hosted MongoDB database, I don't have to change any of the configuration or the connection strings because it's, yeah, you know, it's still going to be the same sort of connection to that data source. Okay, so this is going on at the moment, which shouldn't take too long. It can depend on obviously the load, what's going on there, and all of that. But ultimately, you can have again as many images, versions, tagged versions as you like. And again, you can have different repositories for different things. So, but at the moment, I can see there the deployment succeeded. So if I just click into there, this is my deployment. I could now go to the actual resource there, but just to show you from when you go to all your resources, you will actually see. I'll just show you it from the main list of resources. You can see there's my container registry Linux containers, but I've now got a container instance running. Okay, yeah, and there's the app that I the app name that I gave it. So if I have a look in here, again, I've got a few bits and pieces here. Again, a lot more to go over than we've got time for at the moment, but you can see there's an IP address there. There's no fully qualified domain name. Again, this is something I'm not 100% sure on. On a Windows container, you do get an FQDN, I believe, but I could be missing something. So I'm just going to be using the IP address at the moment anyway. There's ways of mapping DNS to these things anyway. But if you look down here, you've got containers. So here we go. So you can see this is the containers running. There's a bit of a log here. Now there is a way to connect into the container, the running container, but also you can have a look at the actual logs, which sometimes can take a minute or two to actually get the log information. But right now, what I'm going to do is connect to this, and we should see some information being sort of like output here anyway. So if I go back to overview, in my Postman where I was testing the APIs, you can see I had an IP address before, but of course I'm pretty sure this is going to be a different IP address. So it ends with 11122. Yeah, definitely. So I can just change that. Put that there. Now this theoretically, because the container in the cloud is running, I should be able to hit send, and there we go. We've got the data back. Now exactly the same data, but the container is now running in Azure rather than locally. So again, I haven't got security on this application or anything like that, but if I did, that's you've got a containerized web API application there now. So I could call that from Angular, Vue, or whatever other applications that you want to interact with. And just to show what we can do, we can actually say create a new client on there. I'll have to just change the IP address because that was an old one that I was testing with. And the body is, let's have a look. Yeah, let's have a look, Mr. Test. So this is all running, as I say, I'm running the Postman locally, but the actual API is now that container in Azure. So if I just give that a post, it's come back with an ID, so it's obviously got the data. If I go back, get all the clients again, we should see Mr. Test there. Yep, and it does. And equally, we can just verify that by looking at the Atlas, MongoDB Atlas, and do a refresh of that collection, which is no DB clients. There we go. Yep, and you can see Mr. Test there. So ultimately, that's the container now running. You can see we've got a little bit of a spike there because there was a request coming in. But if we look at the container now, we've got one container running. Theoretically, you can start to really get into things where you can have multiple containers. You can actually use orchestration tools like Kubernetes. So what that will allow you to do is orchestrate, like you might have one container, but then when there's a spike of traffic, it'll scale that out to like 5, 10 of them. There's all sorts of things that you can go on. We'll do that in later videos for sure. But just have a quick look in here in the logs. I don't know if it's actually a chance to refresh, but this would log out what we saw when we ran the container locally. You'd get some console log type information here, but ultimately that's certainly running, and we can check a few of the bits and pieces. There's all the like ports that are mapped, if there was any environments, variables and things like that, but the logs aren't quite displaying as yet. But anyway, but ultimately, once you're done with the container, obviously be careful if you're just using this for dev and testing, because if it's carrying on running, even though it's only a small container instance size, it will be costing you money. So you can do exactly the same thing as we saw. We can stop the container, start, restart it, or in this case, delete it. Okay, so I'm just going to go and delete this container. But that's the container, that's the runnable part. This will disappear after a minute or so when it's had a chance to refresh. But the registry itself is still available. So my image, my underlying image that I created, is obviously going to still exist. And you can see there, I've got my repository. That's what I created. And in here, I've got two tags, latest and demo 1 or v1. So I'm actually going to delete the demo 1 because I don't need that at the moment. But incidentally, if I didn't delete it and I did some changes, in fact, I won't delete it for a second. If I went ahead and did some changes into my Node.js application, I could follow the same process again. Just do a build, okay, and if I'm using the same tag, it knows to update that version, okay. If I created a new tag, of course, I would get a new version being listed here, okay, in the tag versions. But if I use that same tag, that one, it would only update the changes basically to that version, okay. And obviously, I could actually remove the image from the command line as well, but while I'm here in the Azure portal, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this version here. Okay, so I'm just left with my latest tag. So that's giving us a good idea of being able to use, you know, the containers in the context of a cloud-hosted image repository, and obviously being able to run instances from those images.